Hello, and welcome to the SD38 Inclusive Practices in Mathematics in the Middle Year series. This one is particularly on planning and design for inclusion in mathematics. We're going to continue to draw on some anchor texts, looking at how we might include UDL in our planning and design. We're drawing on some resources from Katie Novak and looking at Rachel Lambert's particular book on rethinking disability in mathematics. In addition to that, this time we'll be drawing upon some of the pedagogy and thinking in the Cultivating Mathematical Hearts book, and also doing some deep learning around math identity. When it comes to thinking about UDL, we want to think about what it represents and what it means in terms of our planning. When we do a bit of a sentence explosion, universal refers to the variability that we'll have in our students, what they bring to our classes, and how they might be acting as doers of math. We also want to think about what we might do in terms of our design and planning as it relates to creating learning goals, how we think about what barriers we might face when students are entering the learning, and how we might create options and choices for them in their learning experiences. So in doing so, we want to also consider how it is that we can create opportunities for engagement, think specifically about who our learners are so that we can offer different forms of representation to invite students into the learning, but then also to create choices and options for them to be able to express or communicate their math thinking in various ways. When we are designing for inclusion in mathematics, the goal is to support students in becoming independent learners who can access their own learning needs, monitor their own progress, regulate and sustain their interest, effort, and persistence during a learning task. And we also want to think about how we can support students in seeing themselves in the math they are doing, in addition to learning about themselves, each other, and the world around them. We want to think about how we can create conditions for these things to happen. One of the things that we might consider is how we might build a math community, and how we might also support students in growing their habits of their mind, and what that might mean in terms of our ongoing self-reflection, in terms of our own knowledge, and if that means putting in some commitment to growing our pedagogical understanding so that we can be implementing inclusive practices in mathematics. So today we're going to talk about connecting with students, creating a climate for learning, using a template for designing inclusive practices in mathematics, and then that little bit at the end where we're monitoring and reflecting on our own practice. Let's start with engagement. When it comes time to connecting with students, think about how we might design lessons that consider who our students are and how they can connect mathematics with relevant and authentic issues or situations in their lives. How do the learners vary in your class? Is it in the way that they pay attention? Is it in their memory? Is it in their enthusiasm for math? Is it the prior knowledge that they have? How else do they vary? When we think about who our learners are as humans and how they are contributing members of our math community, we want to consider their funds of knowledge and identities, which we'll talk a little bit more of. We want to consider their math identities and how that plays a role in their learning and doing of math. We want to think about their areas of needs and specific strengths. In addition to that, we also want to consider their interests. So when we consider what funds of knowledge and identities are, it's what students bring to their classroom in terms of their identities and previous experiences and the way students learn and do math in their home environments. And so what we want to do is try to make connections to this type of knowledge and the practices that are happening at home so that we can connect to make connections to what we're learning in our classes, so that we can do that by sort of taking in consideration particular contexts for problems and tasks, but also trying to support them in understanding how to apply that math in the place in which they live. And that might require us to think about how we can support students in mathematizing their surroundings and experiences. So in what ways are students seeing their own lived experiences, cultural values, and communities reflected in their learning? How is what we're learning in class helping them grow as individuals and leverage the things that they're bringing to their class? We also want to think about how might we prioritize students' knowledge and identities in the design of our lessons and units. Often we prioritize the learning goals, ultimate learning goals, and once we've designed some proficiency indicators, how we're supporting students moving towards proficiency. We also want to think about who our learners are and how we might connect with pieces of their identity. What is math identity? Well, it's been said by Berry and Horn that it's the process through which we make sense of our experiences in math, and it's partly created by our experiences and partly by how we think about those experiences. Experiences might be how we feel in math class, or if we perceive ourselves to be good or bad at math. And it's essentially having a positive or negative relationship with math. And that can be complicated because it is contextualized depending on the topic that we are engaging in. So we can acknowledge and work towards building positive relationships with math in our classes. And it might require us thinking about what we value and believe about learning and doing, and how we create space for all learners in our class. So much research has been done to show that we learn when the emotional conditions are right. And what that means is students feel like they can take chances and, be a little vulnerable. And what we want to do is kind of consider, what is it that students are bringing into the classroom in terms of what they value around math, and what do they think about when they think about what success is in math? Might it have something to do with speed or performance? Well, it might mean that we need to think about how we can address some of those myths that students have about it, what it means to be good at math, or what it means to do math, and what it means to learn and grow in meaningful ways. Things like the myth of learning, which means that our abilities are fixed, or the myth of fatigue and success, which means that are around mistakes and failures, and if they're bad. And so we want to support students in being able to think about mistakes as opportunities. So this is a math text that has come out recently that talks a little bit about how to we can bust these myths in our classes. And Vanessa Vicaria says that educating ourselves about the factors that affect all our students will help us find unique ways to meet each of our students where they are, helping them each begin to cultivate mindsets that lean more towards notions of growth rather than fixed. And so what that means is we want to sort of think about how we can, connect with each of the learners in our classes, form relationships, consider what their needs are so that we can be responsive, and then, of course, bust some of those myths. We also, in practice, want to consider how we might build habits of the mind and some of the dispositions that go along with it, particularly when students are involved in problem-solving processes, as we want students to feel comfortable with making decisions when they come across things that are challenging, so they can show perseverance, right? And so when they're put into different contexts and they can use math, they can do that in collaborative ways with positive math identities, and then they can, apply different approaches and flexible thinking so that they can work towards goals. So, what's also important to consider are specific students' needs. These can be things that are acting as challenges or barriers to learning and can present itself in different ways. And the reason why it's important to consider specific student needs is so that we can think about how we might design learning experiences to support access to the learning experiences based on those needs. And so some of those needs might be around learning, about around language, around social, emotional, or physical needs. And ultimately, we want to think about what tools that students might benefit from having in order for them to be able to access the learning, and what strategies that they could be using to help them engage in the learning as well. So, when it comes time to creating a climate for learning, think about how we might design positive learning spaces that support all learners. When it comes to thinking about what a math community is, think about, do your students feel safe enough to take mathematical risks? Are they building relationships in and through math? Do students feel like it's okay to make mistakes and that they can learn from them? Do students feel empowered to take on challenges? And what do your students learn about themselves as math learners? And is the math meaningful and relevant to them? You could try surveying students on this, and as the semester or year is beginning, and getting a sense of what they think is a math community that's working towards those math relationships that we talked about previously. And then as you integrate more and more strategies to build this very relational sense of belonging community, you could survey again towards the end of the semester or year and seeing how some of this is changing for them. So, when designing inclusive practices in mathematics, think about how we can enable all learners to closely explore the concepts, procedures, and problem solving with firm goals. This is a template that we can use to support some of the planning. I know that we all have our own unique styles of planning and ways of kind of incorporating some of this thinking, but what it can act as a way for you to kind of spark some interest or considerations as you do plan. On the top left-hand corner are those firm goals that we're talking about, those learning standards that are imperative for students to know and be able to do. And in there also is a language goal, because in math, it is really important that students dialogue using vocabulary and language that is relevant to the discourse at hand. It also provides a space for us to think about who our specific learners are. It's a section called Learner Profiles in the bottom left. And this is where we want to think about possible barriers to learning and what is most important for us to consider as we are designing and planning. In addition to that, you want to be able to identify what students' strengths are and what their interests are, and how that might influence some of the learning experiences that you create, or the particular tasks that you design, or the examples that you provide. And in the middle, this all influences the particular strategies that we will be modeling for students and teaching them over time so that they can practice independently. But it's also taking into consideration the particular strategies that we need to hone in on for very few students too. And we're going to give examples of this in upcoming slides. Also want to think about what tools might be useful to students to manage their learning, things like graphic organizers, materials, discussion prompts, individual things that students could be using, like whiteboards when they're processing information and wanting to share information. Also, how we might support multilingual learners in terms of providing a glossary of terms or text to speech options. particularly for those who might have need some support with reading comprehension. We can look at font size, always providing options for applications in technology and being able to use visual tools. In addition to that, we want to think about how, once we have that in consideration, what are some possible learning activities we can engage in? And in that, where are we going to be offering options or choices for students in the way that they represent their process of learning and their product of learning? In addition to that, what is it that they are going to be able to create and design to be able to show you what they can do and understand. So here's an example of the template in action in a grade 7 context where we're looking at two-step equations with whole number coefficients, constants, and solutions. We're going to kind of plan out the unit with this topic in mind. When we consider the curricular competencies to use, you want to think about what competencies students will be practicing as they engage in some of those learning experiences that you're designing. So I've embedded both curricular competencies and content together to create some of these indicators for proficiency at grade level in grade 7. These would be my expectations for what students should be able to demonstrate at grade level. And what is written in bold blue letters are the competencies, and everything else is to do with the scaffolding of the content through our learning process. So in this unit, students will be able to model, they'll be able to use concrete pictorial and symbolic ways of representing their thinking. They're going to use tools and or technology to visualize and explore two-step equations. They're also going to be able to apply strategies to evaluate expressions and apply multiple strategies to solve problems in context, and develop, demonstrate, and apply mathematical understanding through play. And so let's see how we can consider who our students are in our design of learning experiences. So in terms of creating a language goal, you want to think about what students need to learn about English to express, practice, and apply new information. So in this context, I would hope that students would be able to use math vocabulary and language to participate orally, pictorially, in words, and symbolically, and that they would be able to explain and justify their thinking using sentence frames that I provide. And when we are designing our learning experiences, we always want to start by considering who our students are. When we embrace student variability, we recognize that students have interpersonal variability, right? Their identities are diverse. They have diverse learning needs, or the variety of ways in which students learn and engage with the educational content. They have also prior knowledge, skills, language, and cultural backgrounds, that those developmental disabilities and learning disabilities that we also want to consider, right? And so when we know what that is, and we start thinking about what those are, we want to think about the specific supports that they need in order to access the learning, right? And that might also require teaching strategies. And so we recognize that everyone can work towards the same goal that we have if they're given those particular supports. We can try to anticipate what those barriers to learning might be, like those specific challenges to learning. And when we are planning and designing from the start and thinking about those barriers from the start, we're doing that so that we don't have to adapt and modify right in the moment. And that is going to create opportunities for all students to have access to the learning. right? So when creating learning experiences for a lesson or unit, we can think about what approaches will invite students into the learning and the skills and competencies they can practice while they're growing their understanding. And we can determine the supports that some students need, but that would be helpful for all, and the specific supports that must be provided to specific students based on their learning needs. So, what we also want to think about often is who are those learners that require more support, and what we might differentiate. So, teachers can differentiate the content, the process, the product, or the learning environment. And we do this in accordance to student readiness, their interests, or their specific learning profiles. And generally speaking, when it comes to differentiating, we really only do one of those things based on specific needs of students, right? So we're going to walk through a specific through what it's like in this grade 7 example. If I have students on the left-hand side who require support with executive functioning, I have multilingual learners, I have students that require some support with written output, I have some that have some anxiety in math, and there are some that actually have IEPs that are requiring entry into foundational learning for this particular concept. And I also have noticed in my work with students that they require some constructive group work support so that learning can happen when they're working in small groups. And in addition to that, I have a student who's functioning, has had experience outside of the classroom and is doing quite a bit of the work already. So I might want to think about how I might challenge that student. And so I'm thinking about how I might differentiate the content for that particular student. We are in this grade looking at two-step equations, but for this challenge, I might introduce multi-step equations or coefficients that are not whole numbers. I might start to introduce some things like integers and rational numbers, depending on where they are. Now, that means that all of the supports there I've checklisted might be beneficial to all of these learners. I'm definitely going to be having a glossary for the executive functioning. I am going to ensure that I have a visual schedule. An example of one is on the screen there. So I mostly always write this on the whiteboard and put check marks as I go through a lesson. But this is one that can be individualized for the student to have on their desk, and that you can go around and highlight or teach the student to highlight when certain things are completed. That's even building in a brain break or walking break if necessary, if the student needs it. Also, I find it helpful when I'm planning lessons to chunk lessons into no more than 20-minute sections so that students can remain focused. And that's why I find in this particular class, one of their strengths is focus, because I build that in. I also want to, when I am introducing instructional strategies or routines in the class at the beginning, think about how I might address some of the variance in our learners. And sometimes what I will do is provide parallel questions that students can try their just right question. And I use some of the language from Peter Liljedahl, who says, what's your mild question, what's your medium question, and what's your spicy question? Pick your question of the day, the one that you feel that you can do, and work with a elbow partner to try and tackle it. So this in itself is giving us opportunity to think about how we might be supporting individual learners in our class while we are designing the specific learning opportunities for them. Now, these are examples of possible learning activities that might take place in this unit of study. And some of the things that I might consider as I am starting to think about how I might provide access for all learners, right? So there's multiple strategies involved, there's technology, there's parallel questions, there's an invitation to think about tasks or problem solving in contexts that are interesting to them. There's a hockey question there because this particular class seemed to be interested in hockey, many of them. And also just whatever I am doing with the students, we want to offer as choice and options as they start to practice independently, because the more familiar they get with particular strategies, the more that they can do it on their own. So this is an example of places. These are examples of places that you can go to get rich questions or numeracy task type questions that are connected to place and or context. And then you can choose based on what students' interests are, and or just as an opportunity for students to learn more about their world. Whenever I am sort of designing the learning experiences, though, I'm still continued to think about what tools might students benefit from having as options to manage their learning independently. I'm thinking about what content or process do I need to differentiate for some students and how I might do that. And I'm also thinking about the options I can provide to students for communicating their thinking. And that comes into play in oral forms, written forms, concrete forms, and symbolic ways. But they always need to know that those are four things that we want them to be able to demonstrate when they are engaging in learning around that particular topic. And so we can show them how to do those four things, but in the end, give them options for how they want to demonstrate it. And these are different types of things that we can offer as choices. You can provide a buffet of materials to use. In this case, it could be counters or algebra tiles. We can use tools and technology, so things like Polypad in this case, or we can be looking at various sites for instructional routines that they might go to, or tasks like Enrich. You might think about the type of question you're answering and how you might, differentiate and provide options just right questions that students can select from, the context that we are providing in those word problems, the particular types of tasks that students are engaging with, and who they're working with, and in your classroom, how you're setting it up such that all students are invited into the learning, particularly, say, for example, if it's a math workshop, are the tables designed so that students can collaborate well with one another, and they have and they have space to walk from table to table or table group to table group, or to work on the vertical spaces on the board, and that they're given lots of opportunity to communicate and share. So when it is filled out, this is what the whole template could look like. These are going to be available on RichNet in the inclusive practices in math tile. And as we wrap up, when we plan for inclusion, it's important that we take time to think about how the learning is going. We want to think about what's working, what's challenging, what we might need to learn more about, and the things that we might try moving forward. The next steps are always important, even if it's small. So here's where we can find more resources for inclusive practices on RichNet. And we will get you to think about a few questions as you leave. In what ways can you enhance student engagement? How are you supporting students in strengthening their math identity? If you consider your next unit of study or lesson sequence, what barriers to learning can you anticipate? What tools and strategies might support students engaging in that learning? How might you design for student variability in your lessons or units? And what options can you provide for students to show what they know and can do? Thank you.